So I want to talk about folklore and what the vampire did for people in folklore. And again, we're not talking about fictional vampires or literary vampires. We're talking about actual people who went out into cemeteries and were digging up bodies. And if you're anything like me, you had Miss Leary in 7th grade, and she taught you that mythology served a purpose for the people who believed in those myths. And vampires are really no different. They seem to be this entity that arises at certain times in certain communities to solve a problem, to explain something that cannot otherwise be explained. Now, if we start looking at some of the incidences in Eastern Europe, a lot of things you might expect get blamed on vampires. Crops failing, animals dying in the fields, unplanned pregnancies. These all seem to be, I would call them bonuses, because the vampire, if the vampire's a Christmas tree, it's already there, and now there's these other things we can just hang on it. But what's the big one? What really was the genesis of the vampire belief? In Eastern Europe, it's a little hard to see the forest for the trees because there's so many potential explanations. One of the bigger ones is this, these three major religions that are all pushing against each other at one point. And this one's worth mentioning because there's a lot of power behind it. In the East, you have Orthodoxy. In the West, you have Catholicism. And you have Islam pushing up from the south, and they're all kind of meeting right around Romania. And they're all posing a threat towards each other. And it's not hard to come to the conclusion that people who have a very realistic possibility of dying tomorrow because a duke wants their land and is going to justify it for his religion might have some unrealistic ideas about what could happen after they die. So to get some perspective, it's a little easier to go somewhere other than Eastern Europe. And that leads us to America. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but there's a 100-year-long vampire panic that takes place in New England. Almost all of it is concentrated around Rhode Island and Connecticut. It's, the side note, interesting, adjacent to but not overlapping the witch hunts. Taking place a lot longer, but not overlapping. And I think that's intriguing for a multitude of reasons that we won't go into here now. Maybe we could during Q&A. But taking the vampire out of Eastern Europe and putting it here allows us to kind of remove some variables. The religious strife is not anything like it is in Eastern Europe. Occasionally you have a war taking place, but it's limited. There's not a sustained threat of invasion going on in this part of New England at the time. But what was going on? Well, we find out that incidences of vampire scares track very closely with incidences of outbreaks of consumption, like tuberculosis. How do we know that? Well, we have doctor's records, we have newspaper reports, we have the testimony of the families. They understood what was going on. They knew that there was something in the community that was killing people slowly. They just couldn't figure out why. And so, left with no other alternatives, they said, who died last? Maybe they're coming back and dragging the rest of us down with them. It's intriguing to me that they never used the word vampire in America. The people who were digging up the graves never used the word vampire. But their practices are a DNA match for what's going on in Eastern Europe. They're digging up the bodies, they're flipping corpses over, they're cutting off heads, they're crossing things over the bodies, and they're burning them. And not as often in Europe, but in America there seems to be this this idea that if you eat the organs of the deceased, it will help inoculate you. Right.
That's an extreme.
So spare a thought for the person who's dying of tuberculosis who's told, eat the organs of the person who already died from tuberculosis, and that'll fix you. Lo and behold, when does the American vampire panic end? It ends right around the same time we identify the cause of tuberculosis and what passes it between people. Something else really interesting happens around the same time. This is all in the 1890s. The last American vampire to be killed is in 1893. I can't remember exactly when tuberculosis is identified. It's in the 1890s. Dracula is also published in 1897. So there's some theories that, well, now that this is a part of a well-read and beloved piece of fiction, suddenly it seems ridiculous to go out and dig up a body and treat it like we would treat this fictional character of Dracula. I would submit to you that this was always right in front of us. Because when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, he used a word as a synonym for vampire. He used the word Nosferatu. He got that from a travelogue called Land Beyond the Forest. It was written by an English lady who had spent a lot of time in Transylvania. She used the word Nosferatu as a synonym for vampire when she was talking about these folk beliefs. But as it turns out, Nosferatu does not mean vampire. It means plague carrier. And I would also submit to you that when F.W. Murnau made the movie Nosferatu in the 1920s, he was aware of this for two reasons. One, he sets the action of the movie in a German city that is undergoing an outbreak of the plague. And two, if you look at the fangs on his vampire, they're not like snake fangs, like you're used to seeing in a vampire. They're right here in front. Like what?
Rats.
Like rats. And if you're already way ahead of me, what do rats carry? Plagues. So the next time you're watching True Blood and you want to fuck Eric Northman, get a vaccine instead. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dana.